Hello, welcome to the Realm of Ideas is Free to All. This is episode 23, Love, Beauty, Truth, the component part of a civilization. So what we're doing here is a series of live streams, me ruminating about different aspects of my understanding of my work. Part of it is to basically kind of conjoin those things so that I better understand them and kind of put them in a kind of cohesive whole. I had done these on another platform, but that didn't work out. So what I'm doing is redoing them on YouTube as a series of kind of brief talks to kind of recall, kind of condense and kind of like hopefully standardize my thinking. Started in December. Started with the operation of the metaphor. Introduce myself. I'm Bruce Gemmell. I'm an architectural researcher, a draftsman, and speculist, and Imagineer, all kinds of funny words. But basically, I'm kind of like happy that in my lifetime, architecture could become a kind of research subject, and it kind of has allowed me to basically go off on my own kind of non-built but theorized kind of approach to architecture. I'm not against the idea of building. I just find that it was easier to kind of cover a lot more ground in terms of like the ideas of architecture, which I think has always appealed to me, even if the actual practice was not something I felt was for me. I enjoyed architectural education. I enjoyed architectural school. I think I found that there were certain limitations to that, but at the same time, I found that I enjoyed the kind of the dialogue, discussion, and kind of discourse of architecture as a theoretical engagement. Anyway, so we started with an idea that's very important to me, which was the operation of the metaphor and how that started to kind of like coalesce in terms of like work. Pretty much started when I was a kind of young professor, and then kind of has carried through into the work as it's gone on. So I started talking about the idea of the metaphor, and of course, what's happened in the course of time since that was an academic program in, I guess, 1988 or 89, was kind of feeling a more contextual understanding of what that was in terms of the bigger picture. I didn't have the understanding that I kind of would have now, understanding what I do in terms of like a process related aspect of it engaged in cosmological sense, and then understanding how that kind of was the primary function from which, what we call metaphor in the kind of literary or artistic sense, but understanding that it comes from a kind of like natural sense. So that was the beginning of that, and then followed that up with talking about something called unbreakable bonds, which is something that is kind of component parts of a destiny related aspect. Destiny, I would say, within the context of the term as it's understood, not in a kind of fantastic kind of term in terms of like predetermination, but in terms of like the philosophical sense within the kind of way in which I would say Ortega Gasset determines it, in terms of like a consequence that is a kind of part of an existential circumstance that an individual or a group kind of understands as they come into maturity within their generation. So the unbreakable bond is basically a social metaphor or a kind of societal kind of like construct. And that's something that kind of comes about as a result of history and the time that you find yourself. Then we talked about the art of finding what needs to be said, and talked about criticism as a kind of circumstance, as an unbreakable bond, and how it was also one of the aspects of it was we talked about the idea of an indicator of societal health. Then we talked about architecture as a verb. We talked about drawing. We talked about towards an organic architecture is where I come in, which is basically where I kind of started, probably in terms of where I felt that there was a great American tradition that kind of got subverted, and then kind of felt the need to kind of pick that back up and actually kind of fulfill that. I feel as if like that tradition may in fact have a potential that could in fact lead to what I call a truly organic architecture. I remember a lecture that I gave in which I kind of said that in my lifetime I expect to grow a building rather than build it, and it was met with kind of like, it was one of those lectures that the best lectures I feel are the ones where, before there's applause, there's that silence of like of stunned, kind of silence, and then people kind of like will kind of give you recognition for and the work. I felt that was a good lecture. Anyway, so then when we went for that, we went into the realm of we went into like authority of ideas as regard that the indicator of societal health. Then we talked about my specific journey. We talked about my past journey, like I called like my past architecture, which was my youth, my recent past architecture, then the aftermath, and that was basically from when I left being a professor, which was like in the early 1990s until now. Then we talked about indicators of societal health, emotional attachment ideas, basically some different component parts that I found along the way were kind of aspects of the circumstances that I engaged with. And we talked about things specific to the unbreakable bonds, which were those societal kind of aspects that we talked about, then kind of some of their component parts, which was the fact that not only are they things that we put together in terms of kind of be able to kind of manifest the kind of destiny of a particular time, but they also can be used as a kind of diagnostic tool. Then from there, we talked about the idea of force, power, rule, and persuasion, which is how, which was another kind of component part of how we move through ideas to get to a certain point. Last week, we talked about tradition and culture and basically made the point that there are things that we do that kind of lead us in a certain direction. I talked about some individuals that were kind of like instructive to me in terms of what those were and how they kind of manifested in my ideas. And then we talked about what we would be doing today, which is the kind of three last pieces of the recounting of the original series. From there, we will go back to more kind of autobiographical, kind of like work-related things. But for now, we're just kind of filling out the, I'd say the kind of intellectual, philosophical parts of the work. So today we'll be talking about love, beauty, and truth, which I think are three components that are kind of basically the essence of what it is that we investigate when we do what we do in the kind of speculative aspects. I kind of feel that two of them were kind of clearly indicated, again, in the work we've been talking about and following along, and some of the things that I've taken out of, process philosophy. I'm not a philosopher, not a process philosopher. I have a tremendous amount of admiration for Albert North Whitehead. I've read several of his pieces. I have tried to read Process and Reality, and I mean, it's like not the kind of thing that I would say I've put my eyes over a lot of the pages and a lot of the words. I understand some basic concepts and components. I find that Adventures of Ideas and Aims of Education are kind of more accessible books. There's also read some of the pieces in terms of like his ideas of mathematics, but I feel as if like there are some component structures that ironically kind of came across, and then by reading this, I kind of found as if it kind of helped me understand some things that I had been working across. So I think one of the things I do remember about what he says in Aims of Education is that, like, instead of introducing students to everything, to introduce them to some key component ideas and introduce them in a kind of a large perspectival aspect. I mean, put them into a lot of different combinations. And I think that for me, speaking to someone this week, friend, and came across the idea of perspective. This was, again, going back to Ortega, who, again, was a person who was probably around the same time, certainly in the generation of Whitehead, but I don't know how much, if any, contact there was. There certainly was an awareness, and the fact that, like I said, in Marius's history of philosophy, Whitehead is certainly is certainly kind of looked upon with reverence and respect as having a worthy component aspect. So anyway, so here we are, and we're going to talk a little bit about these first three components: beauty and truth coming from the principles of civilization, as annotated in Whitehead, and love being an aspect that I think holds both of them together, which I believe comes from, like, Meditations on Intellectual Love by Ortega. But anyway, as is our new feature, after my introduction of where we are, we're going to do what's new in Julie. And Julie, just like we say what's new in science or what's new in art, what's new in Julie? So
I gotta sit
tell us,
because Julie's very tired.
what's new? What's new in Julie?
Well,
I know that we're working on a drawing that we kind of did quite successfully. We're not completed yet, but we kind of worked on the parietal eye in the at the Met tonight.
oh yeah.
We want to talk about that. Or you want to talk about
show it in progress, but it's not done.
No, but we can talk about the process.
Oh
We
sure.
can talk about where we've gone and what we're going to be doing.
Okay.
So this is what's new in Julie.
Okay, sorry, I have to get.
I know,
it
as
out.
if we're talking about a topic, as if it was something like, say, kind of science or kind of like nature or the weather. Okay.
You haven't seen the actual. You only.
No, I haven't. I've seen the
my
photographs.
photos.
Yeah.
Looks better in the actual.
Yeah.
Too.
Also, an interesting thing that we found, there used to be a piece that I had that kind of long since got destroyed after one of my many moves, but I found this piece, which I would renamed Mr. Stickhead. Mr. Stickhead was a object that existed that I found in the street in one of my objects. And what I'll be talking about in coming weeks is the difference between measurements and entanglements. Because I believe there's two component parts of my work in terms of my models, one being entanglements and the other one being measurements. And I'll actually read a piece by basically referring to Poincaré that Whitehead talks about in Truth and Beauty. So anyway, what's new in Julie? Can we see?
Sure.
Okay.
You're at a better angle.
Okay.
There might be a little bit of graphite glare. I want to bring it closer.
I'm trying to get it all in the photograph.
Maybe zoom in for a close-up. Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Then you can really see it.
So what's happening here is that, oops, don't want to put my fingers on the
Probably.
graphite. Okay, so anyway, what happens is there is a Chinese jade object.
It's actually Mughal Indian.
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
I thought it was
it's from
Chinese.
the other side of the map.
Oh, okay. Oh, because it's
Yeah.
Southeast Asian. Oh, so it's Indian.
It's from the Indian and Persian.
Oh, it's in that case.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that case.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it
Oh no,
does
I know
have
it
a
now. I do
Chinese
know. I do know it now.
base,
Yes,
yeah.
it has it because it looked like a scholar's rock. It looks like a
It
scholar's rock
does.
in terms of base.
It actually looks
Hmm.
very, very Asian.
What I love about it is the fact that, like, it has this aspect where the parietal eye, which you saw as an aspect of kind of with salamanders, wasn't it?
Certain, not salamanders, but iguanas. Certain reptiles,
Okay.
certain lizards
Okay.
have them. A tuatara has because I had done.
Oh, you
That
did
was
tuatara
the
painting.
JCVI painting.
Right.
So certain amphibians
Mhm,
have a
mhm.
have a parietal third eye,
Mhm.
which I can explain if you like.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, the parietal eye in certain animals, and I think they're almost entirely, they're not in any mammals that I know of, is equivalent to our pineal gland.
Mm-hmm.
Now, our pineal gland is buried deep in our brain and is, believe it or not, named after the pine nut because of its size and shape. It is literally about the size and shape as a pine nut. And don't quote me, I'm really tired. I believe it's in the hypothalamus, but I'm not, I forget. Anyway, that produces melatonin that regulates our human sleep-wake cycles. And our sleep-wake cycles, our circadian clock,
rhythms, right?
yeah, that governs everything from our hormones to our endocrine system to our immunity. It's terribly, terribly important.
You know, it's
Yeah.
funny. Two things that
Mhm.
we've noticed in the last, say, 20 years in science. One is microbiome, the other is circadian rhythms.
Mhm.
I remember when we first started to read science,
Yeah.
very, very little was ever spoken about. I mean, people knew what the circadian rhythms
Yeah,
were,
they were
but it was
never
kind of
brought.
like it was like the appendix. You know, it was like something
Yeah.
that, yeah, we know it's there, but we don't really kind of think much of it.
Mhm.
It's amazing how much we've come to understand the importance, you know, and as well as the microbiome. So I'm
Mhm.
wondering, these two things also have a correlation to each other, because I'm sure that just the same way that the microbiomes basically have so much to do with our basic every function of our body,
And they're
I'm
fun. Yeah.
sure it's tied to our rhythms.
Oh, I'm sure. In fact, there were connections that people never made before, where they find in people with schizophrenia and people with autism, they have severely compromised microbial communities,
Hmm.
and their microbes are nothing like the microbes of the healthy intestinal flora.
Hmm.
They are missing some of the good bacteria, and they also have the presence of very strange negative bacterial colonies that other people don't have. The proportions are different. And this governs people's mental state tremendously. People who are experiencing depression have wildly different microbiomes from people who are basically happy, if that's possible in this creepy, creepy world.
As it
But
is.
if I make it back to the
Yeah,
drawing.
right.
So when I saw this tri-lobed jade Indian Mughal box on the, actually, interestingly, the other side of the Met from the Asian wing, it looks incredibly Asian. And in fact, it is an
Fooled me.
Indian piece. What?
Fooled me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, it did. And it fooled a lot of people. I actually had a lot of people come up to me where I was drawing in the Chinese wing on the third floor, which is where I do often draw, asking me where the piece I was drawing was and why didn't they see it in the cases, because they totally expected it to be there. Now, it does have a carved Chinese wooden stand, which I left out of my drawing because I'm not trying to make a facsimile. I am using the object as a metaphor. Now, if you notice, it's also in the shape of the human brain. And there's a tail that I haven't done yet coming down here, which runs right to the spinal column, which actually shows that the parietal, it's weird, it's going the other, that the third eye, in fact, it's all backwards, links directly to the neurological system in amphibians. So, in fact, there's a fascinating research photo. I always do all my own research and that, and then use the pieces at the Met as metaphors, showing an infected a parietal eye on somebody's pet iguana, and I'd never seen that, where it was bulging and bloodshot and very malformed. So it sort of almost took on the look of a crystal ball. It had an otherworldly qualities. It lifted off the body. Most of the parietal eyes are almost like a pool. They're almost like kind of a whitish, grayish, yellowish indentation, in almost like an interruption in the plates of the skin of the amphibians. This was like a bulging, like a turgid glass ball. So I wanted that quality not as a disease state, but as an elevated state. So what I did was, and I drew this in this very day, was using an Australian black opal research photo that I found on the science site as my parietal eye model of an evolved eye, not a disease state eye, but one that is becoming.
Interesting.
So
Yeah. Good. Well, I mean, I
Yeah.
think what's interesting is that like
Say.
what happens is you find this relationship between animated and inanimate. You have an inanimate jade object, which basically kind of like is networked through the neurological system with the reptile,
Mhm.
and it's so like and its parietal eye. But at the same time, the piece that you had this knob that was also in relationship to the parietal eye. So that
Yeah,
gave
yeah.
you a kind of like a situation where you could create that kind of overlap. And then you tried to make the plates. You know, you see the you see, I you know what's really beautiful is how you use the plates as a way to kind of to bring it together with the jade pieces.
Thank
So
you.
it's like, you know, the kind of like you have the animate, the inanimate, the conscious, all kind of network together, and kind of like at the same time you see them as simultaneously they're disparate pieces as well as their kind of cohesion. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the end of the completion of this. But I mean, it's like it's been so successful so far.
And I just started it last.
Yeah, no,
last
it came
Friday.
together really fast.
Well, thank
Okay.
you.
All
I
right, so
really appreciate
so that's
it.
what's new with that's what's new in Julie,
Thank you.
right?
That
And
was
kind of
my
like keeping
cameo.
up on the world of Julie.
That was my cameo. Thank
Okay,
you.
see you next
Thank
week.
You, Pat.
Okay, so
Thank you, Pat.
love, beauty, and truth. So what? Again, we go back to the Adventures of Ideas, and at the end, part 4 is about civilization. Now, we talked last week about traditions and culture, and we talked about the fact that at a certain point, certain things become conditional. I talked about the fact that for me, one of the most important inventions, maybe the most important invention that man ever had, was suicide, because it basically kind of questions that idea of persistence. You know, we have this, we sense this persistent urge that we assume comes from our animal nature and kind of comes from that impulse to survive and reproduce. That is basically the basis of which we write The Origin of Species. And that has been something that has been kind of like a kind of primary kind of focus for a lot of human activity. Anyway, as a result, what happens is at a certain point, there starts to become conditions on which an individual or a society basically decide that without these things, we do not continue. Now, there are the things that could basically become insurmountable. And maybe some people would kind of say, you know, it's not necessary for me to continue back around and come back around and kind of wait for it to be rebuilt. Or the fact that in itself, when these things are lost, this particular thing is lost. I mean, I've always felt a certain importance to things like the kind of humor, the wit of Voltaire, or the kind of like wit or kind of like kind of nature of which the Encyclopedia of Diderot was written, in the fact that there's this idea that if we're not careful, very similar to Ortega's idea, that if we fall below our destiny, we will basically lose that organizational capacity that sustains it. And I believe that's very, very true. So one of the things that Whitehead talks about is the fact that, and he says it right away in the kind of preface, and I'll read it to you, is like the title of this book's Adventures of Ideas bears two meanings, both applicable to the subject matter, one meaning in the effect of certain ideas of promoting the slow drift of mankind towards civilization. This is the adventure of ideas in the history of mankind. The other meaning is the author's adventure in framing the speculative scheme of ideas, which shall be explanatory of the historical adventure. So he's basically kind of saying, this is a thing that could exist as an impulse. And here's one chart that I can kind of look at that could identify maybe our path. At least that's the way I kind of see it. So anyway, as he talks about these kind of incremental possibilities, and this goes back to maybe the idea of metaphor in itself, is the fact that entanglement, as I see it, has given opportunity for complication, greater sophistication, better kind of understanding and a kind of like more intricacy and complexity. I mean, we've talked about the fact, and again, I always refer to that beautiful segment in the Carl Sagan Cosmos, where he does a series of simple line drawings, and you see by the way in which each individual piece entangles itself, it comes up with a what I would call a condition. The condition basically creates opportunities for greater entanglement and deeper intricacy and complexity. And that takes us from particles and concentrates from energies to particles to elements to amino acids to proteins and so forth to eventually consciousness. And you see the fact that at each one of these levels many kind of things kind of happen and kind of bring us to these kind of like greater degrees of complexity. But I think in a way, I don't know if this is a direct analogy, it's not written as one, but he does see this kind of idea of moving towards certain things. And in the first section of the book, he talks about those things that he felt were important in terms of that, which was the kind of the human soul, the humanitarian ideal, aspects of freedom from force and persuasion and foresight. We talks about the sociological components that basically are things that you can chart, and that the balance and kind of and the balance and understanding of these things have allowed us to kind of see certain ways in which maybe the understanding the intricacies and the ins and outs of these things kind of moves us forward. But anyway, at a certain point, certain things become important elements. And I think at the end of the book, when he talks about civilization, he talks about that idea, especially in relationship to truth and beauty. And he also talks about it in relationship to the fact that along with that, there are the ideas of kind of like adventure and peace. But I think the idea is truth, beauty, and adventure. And I think I would add another component, which is what I would call, what Ortega talks about in terms of love. Because I think love is basically that thing that makes things indispensable. And I think the indispensable part is that part that I say, becomes part of what I would call the unbreakable bond, is that it can be taken away, it can be dismantled, but it's valuable and consequential in terms of the fact that it creates something of consequence. And it can be elevated, or it can be kind of uncoupled and kind of coupled with something else. And an example I gave, which I also talked about last week, is the fact that like at a certain point, there are certain traditions that basically became, just like our techniques and traditions were based in superstition or religion or other kind of things that were kind of like not as successful in being able to chart their course forward. I think that when one of the great achievements of Western society, and it's basically been a tremendous advancement, was when technique was coupled with reason, and that unbreakable bond has served us very well. And there's just something I kind of feel that we need to kind of understand and appreciate, because right now people are questioning this bond. And I find that absurd, because it's not like they're saying we have a superior possibility that we're looking for. We want to go back to a time of less complexity and intricacy, to a time that was more primitive. So I feel that the idea of reason-based inquiry or reason-based techniques, as opposed to sentimental or romantic or religious or superstitious-based techniques, is a mistake. It's the one has clearly shown itself to be superior. And an clear example is that we used to sacrifice virgins and animals and all kinds of things and do silly dances to create rain. And we know now that these were just stupid. And again, we were just too ignorant to know better. But I don't see the benefit to going back to that when we have something that allows us to kind of test our theories and kind of predict potentials for advancements. So anyway, that's kind of what I'm talking about. So what we see now is these three component pieces as kind of maybe elements that kind of indicate that there is a civilization. and that conditions are kind of being described. That certain things, and we talked about it last week, is that we will decide that if under a certain circumstance we would either not continue or that our culture would cease to exist. Now, one of the things I talked about in my life was the fact that when I was a little boy and growing up in Queens, there was this idea that we would see uh, spaceships and flying cars, and our our adventures would be much more in terms of things going out into space and into the horizon than there would be things that were kind of just surviving. So I felt that the horizon of ideas in 1960, when I was born in 1959, in 1964 at the World Fair in Queens, that the horizon of ideas, the horizon of imagination was very high, maybe the highest it had ever been in cultural history. And it certainly isn't at that place now, because we haven't even been able to kind of achieve some of the things that were achieved when I was a little boy. Anyway, it seems like we're struggling to kind of even understand the nature of the importance of going back in that direction. So as a result, what happens is those conditions become very firm. I mean, I remember myself growing up in the 80s and kind of like living through the Cold War and thinking that these things that were going to be the propulsion that were going to take us out into space and towards the horizon of infinity basically just became weapons that we would use to annihilate each other. And to me, this was an incredibly cynical and incredibly bitter reality to have to contend with, that instead of this incredible sense of wonder and adventure, curiosity, and imagination run wild, we were just simply cowering as adversaries in this kind of like ridiculous kind of like inability to kind of understand that we were kind of like burning ourselves with the match we had created. I think it was that the thing we'd invented a form of fire and didn't understand that we were basically going to annihilate, immolate ourselves with that. So it's kind of like if you look back at a situation where you kind of say, hey, fire gives us warmth, but don't fall into it or don't kind of burn everyone to death. We basically kind of like almost did that to ourselves. So it was incredibly difficult. But in terms of the condition I'm talking about, one of the things I remembered was once I came to understand the reality of nuclear annihilation, which was a very real possibility in the 1980s, I said to myself, this is not something I want to survive. This is not something I want to be part of. And I think what it was that as a young architect, as an intellectual, as someone who enjoyed visiting the New York Public Library and the Metropolitan Museum and the Morgan Library and the kind of the Frick, which is now open again. Great to see that. Fantastic renovation. Being able to kind of be in a place like New York where there is such a cultural legacy. But I came to understand that cultural legacy had kind of become, kind of stunted and was no longer progressive. But at the same time, it did exist. So I could look back and see the kind of great things in the works of Dostoevsky and kind of like Rembrandt and Van Dyck and Vermeer and Leonardo, and understand and appreciate that genius was something of consequence, and it was something that we had to basically kind of like revere and hold on to, and at least nurture until it bloomed again. So for me, that was the condition I kind of set for myself, is that I will accept the idea of maintaining the circumstance as long as it doesn't continue to deteriorate. But at the point where these places, these great legacies, were ever to be removed or eliminated, I had no interest in being part of that. So that's what I meant by that culture of the West that had created these things that started in Egypt and Rome and Greece and kind of continued in to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and kind of came across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States. That legacy was something I was very happy to be able to contribute to, in my own small way. And that I felt that if I wasn't able to contribute to that, and if that was gone, I did not want to live in a time back in a kind of primitive form prior to that. So that's why I kind of look at these things, these kind of societal indicators, and kind of test and understand, like, hey, how firm is the ice? How firm is the ground on which I walk? What can I basically assume is right? So that's basically that idea of a kind of condition for civilization. The fact that, but as Whitehead very beautifully does in Adventures Ideas, he's kind of like shows us that this thing, which is something that again we try to appreciate, that given the intuition and potential of utilizing entanglement and condition, that we can create opportunities for greater complexity and intricacy. So it's not something that happens outside of us. It's something that basically we have a stake in. So we can also see it in other parts, and we can also see it within ourselves. So that brings us to these two pieces that I think, these three pieces that I think kind of make up the pursuits that I look towards. So we have love, beauty, and truth. So these are very, very difficult terms, and that's why we'll basically spend one episode on each one of them. The first one will be truth, then beauty, then love. So I think that we've all heard these terms, we all know these terms, but when we start thinking about them, they become incredibly intricate. They become incredibly difficult. So let me talk about something that isn't truth, in terms of something that may be kind of something that we can kind of look at. Now, I know that in his sections in the chapters on truth, Whitehead takes a different approach, but let me give an example of something I think is kind of very instructive. We know the difference between honesty. We've heard honesty and we've heard truth. And I think one is a kind of like societal thing and one is an existential thing. We understand the idea that someone is being honest, and then we understand the idea of kind of like someone being truthful. And I want to make a distinction that I think is important. We have a situation where we have this object, and if I look at it, I'm looking at it and I see, right, what I see. Now, if I look at this, I'm seeing a cube that has 9 blue dots on it. The person who's looking at the screen sees 9 green dots. If I do this, I'm seeing 9 white dots. The other person is seeing 9 yellow dots. So basically, the point of view will give us a different understanding. Are either of us wrong? No, we're both right. So what we're doing is we're giving an honest appraisal, right, of what we see. However, the truth is that all these component parts of this create the essence of this object. So it's a kind of a simplistic, maybe even a poor example, but I think we need to kind of distinguish between the idea of what somebody would consider honest and what one would consider truthful. So truthful is something that I think is getting to an essence of what we can relate of appearances. Reality is something that we don't question. If it exists, it obviously exists or it doesn't exist. But we don't look at the truth of reality. We basically understand the reality of itself. So therefore, truth is basically related to that of appearance, the things that we see around us. So in this case, it's like, if I look at this point, I see a diamond. Someone else who's oriented 45 degrees from me sees a square, right? And I mean, what happens is we move it around. I can make it so that looks like a square, but then I can move it around and kind of say, oh, it's actually a cube. I remember one of the things that was always interesting to me was that, someone would see certain things at kind of, great orders of magnitude of distance, and they would see something that looked like an oscillation, and then they realized it wasn't an oscillation; it was rotation. But again, their perspective was such that it took them a while to realize at that distance that revolution, right, really didn't make much of a difference in terms of that particular case. So we have that in terms of this situation. And it brings me to kind of like start with something that I believe is an interesting introduction into truth. So it's like I'll go more into this next week, but I just want to start with this. And he says, what is appropriate to one is appropriate to the other. Let me start with the whole. Let's start with the whole paragraph. The truth relation, as realized in experience, always involves some element of appearance. Like I said, for the separate prehensions of the two composite facts have been integrated so that the two objects stand in the unity of a contrast with each other. So what happens is almost kind of like we described in terms of metaphor, is the fact that there is an overlap. There is a pattern that basically coexists between two prehensions. There is an institution of a limited identity of pattern involved in the contrast of the diverse essences. In virtue of this identity, there is a transference of subjective form from the feeling of one object to that of the other. What is the appropriate to one is appropriate to the other. The intuitive recognition is that is so. Is the subjective form including its self-justification of its own transference from the object on one side to the contrast to the object on the other side. In this way, one object as a real fact obtains an adjustment of the relative value of its factors by reason of its analogies to another object. In other words, it becomes a real fact tinged with its appearance. By itself, its factors would not be felt in those proportions. To know the truth partially is to distort the universe. For example, the savage who can only count up to 10 enormously exaggerates the importance of the small numbers, and so do we, whose imaginations fail when we come to millions. This is kind of leading to the point I want to make. It is an erroneous moral platitude that it is necessarily good to know the truth. And I think this is kind of some of the things that I think we'll kind of start to think about. Because, like I said, the difference between honesty and the fact that this is what I feel I see, right, and the truth, right, if there is such a thing, right, hinges on this capacity. The minor truth may begot the major evil, and the major evil may take the form of the major error. Poincaré, and it's interesting he talks about Poincaré, because Poincaré was probably a generation or two before Whitehead. I mean, Whitehead dies, I think, like 45, 47, and Poincaré thinks that dies in like 1912. But anyway, it's like he is probably very similar in the fact that Poincaré was probably the last universalist or kind of natural philosopher or historian. I mean, he's known in the fact that he was kind of equally well-versed in mathematics. I mean, most people know him as a mathematician, but he also was an engineer. He talked about the philosophy of science. He talked about physics, theoretical physics. So he was, of consequence in all these fields. So he's probably like the last person, unless of course you kind of talk about some of the Martians who can really kind of be able to kind of hang on to that tradition of what we might have called earlier a natural philosopher, whereas it was important, as it was also for Whitehead, because again, Whitehead comes from a position where he starts out as a logician, mathematician, works his way through history of science, and then into metaphysics, and into kind of like cosmology for the most part, and theology, and which is also kind of an aspect of that as well. But I think here's what he says. Poincaré points out that instruments of precision used unseasonably may hinder the advance of science. For example, if Newton's imagination had been dominated by the errors in Kepler's laws, as disclosed by modern observation, the world might still be waiting for the laws of gravitation. The truth must be seasonable. And I believe, if I'm correct, what I think he's talking about is that measurement can be deceiving. And one of the things I'll talk about is that I have two component parts that I weigh in terms of my work. One is what I would call entanglement and conditioning, and the other one is what I would call the kind of myth of measurement myths. And I believe one of the things that kind of is important to understand is that you can have something that can be a specific fact or a specific measurement, but it can be exaggerated in the case where if one's too biased of the importance of such a thing, it may hinder the imagination from seeing beyond that limited framework. And I think that's a key component. And one of the things that I think happens when people are too quick to kind of see the importance and really understand the truth as pertains to any particular kind of like set of information without the kind of relationship and the context that kind of fills out that thinking. So that's kind of a beginning of where we kind of sit going into these last three pieces. So basically what happens is with these last three pieces with truth, beauty, and love, we basically complete the recollection of this first group of ideas. And as a result, we will be able to kind of like go into what's the next step. At the point where what was interesting was I didn't want to change the original format. I basically felt that this format was kind of really cool. And I said, but it's interesting is now that I've come through it a second time, there's been a lot of changes. So as a result, where I'm headed is different. So I think that what happens is when I look at what my notes were from my previous iteration and where they are now, I see a different kind of direction. So that kind of means as if and I do feel as if I fleshed out some of these things. Some of the things that I've kind of talked about basically were differently weighted in terms of the first go around. But again, and that also was a part of the fact that there was a different objective as well. But I don't know if the objective basically weighed that heavily on it as it might have believed to be. So with that, the idea is what consequence of the context of the bias of information or the measurements with which we make and the tools we use to make these measurements, how do they give away who we are? And I think that some of the pieces that I'll kind of talk about as we start to get into them in terms of some of the things that I kind of do in terms of my models will kind of be very interesting because I think there's a bunch of things that I've started to do now in terms of these two basic components that kind of interest me in my work. The one being, like I said, entanglements and conditioning, and the other one being like measurements and their kind of like and the kind of confusions and complexities and stumbling blocks that they kind of create for us. One being a kind of like the entanglement and conditioning is that thing where I kind of feel as if it's just kind of pure unbridled imagination and curiosity, and it's kind of most pure and honest and interesting case. And the other one being the stumbling blocks of the fact that we're constantly, as I've said before, judging without understanding. I think that may be also kind of situation of what Whitehead is talking about in terms of like Poincaré's warning, is that had Newton put too much emphasis on certain measurements and their significance without the proper context, he may have kind of put himself in a completely different frame of mind and never had allowed his imagination to come up with the beautiful theories that basically allowed us to kind of get to where he got us. So anyway, that's it for now. Next week it will be episode 24, be the 11th of May. It will be truth. I will be visiting a friend this week on Friday and having some fun, and that will be exciting. I look forward to that. And maybe there'll be some things that I can bring back from that exchange and kind of talk about next week. Also, what I think I'm going to start to do, I mean, I'm really enjoying the kind of like, this week in Julie. And I think what I'm going to start to do is kind of maybe if I can start to do some more of the engagements with people like I've done previously, and I kind of did on my other, but I really like the live stream format, but I don't know who's going to, aside from Julie, who's going to be up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I could probably do it at a different time, but, we'll kind of look into that. So as we're finishing up this first go round, there's a lot of potential interest in what I'm looking at. So anyway, as we are at the end here, let's say, as we do, the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all for us to maintain this. Okay, thank you.